It began with a simple idea that now feels almost impossible to argue against. Imagine a world where people would work until they collapsed, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Now imagine tens of thousands of those people deciding all at once that enough is enough. That is where this story starts. May 1st of 1886, across the United States, workers step away from the machines, the tools, the factory floors, not exactly quietly, but all together. They gather in streets and public squares with a shared demand that feels modest, but was treated as quite radical at the time. 8 hours of work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for life. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to step back into the reality of industrial America in the late 19th century. Cities like Chicago were booming, packed with factories and rail yards, and endless noise. Workers were putting in more than 60 hours a week, often in dangerous conditions for wages that barely sustained them. Immigrants poured into these cities looking for opportunity, only to find themselves trapped in cycles of labor that offered little escape. Employers held enormous power over them. They could fire workers for organizing, blacklist them from future jobs, and bring in replacements without any hesitation. The system was not designed to bend easily, especially for the workers. Chicago, in particular, became a focal point for labor unrest. It was not just an industrial hub, but a city alive with organizing, debate, and competing ideas about how to change the system. Some groups published for reform through unions and collective bargaining. Others believed more radical change was needed. Tensions were already high long before May of 1886 arrived. The memory of earlier strikes and economic hardship still lingered, and both workers and business leaders understood that something significant was building. When May 1st arrived, it did not explode into violence. It unfolded with a sense of purpose. Hundreds of thousands of workers across the country joined strikes and rallies. In Chicago, tens of thousands took to the streets. Families marched together. Workers sang songs about reclaiming their family time. There was energy, but also discipline. This was not chaos. This was coordination. For a brief moment, it looked like a powerful and peaceful movement might actually force change. But history has a way of pivoting in a single moment, and that moment came only 2 days later. On May 3rd, outside of the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company plant in Chicago, striking workers gathered as the workday ended. Tensions had been building around strikebreakers, those brought in to replace the workers who had walked out. Words turned into confrontation, and confrontation drew the attention of the police. Eventually, shots were fired. Workers fell. The exact details blur depending on the account, but the result is clear. Blood was on the ground, and the movement had just crossed into something far more volatile. Outrage spread quickly. Flyers were printed calling for another rally the following evening at Haymarket Square. The message was simple: protest the violence, demand justice, continue the push for the 8-hour workday. By the time people gathered on May 4th, the mood was different from the day before. It was still organized, yes, still largely peaceful, but there was an undercurrent of anger that had not been there before. And anger has a way of causing problems. Even so, the rally itself began calmly. Speakers addressed the crowd. Rain fell silently. People came and went. At one point, even the mayor stopped by, observing the situation, and left apparently satisfied that nothing dangerous was unfolding. As the event wore on, the crowd began to thin. It was getting late. The weather was not helping. The final speaker was wrapping up when police moved in, forming ranks and ordering the remaining crowd to kindly disperse. What happened next is one of the most debated moments in American labor history. A bomb appeared, thrown into the line of advancing police. This bomb exploded, killing one officer instantly and injuring many others. And then everything collapsed into what can only be described as absolute and utter chaos. Gunfire erupted almost immediately. In the darkness, with smoke and panic filling the square, it became nearly impossible to tell who was firing at whom. Some accounts suggest that protesters fired shots, and others argue that the police, reacting to the explosion, opened fire into the crowd. But what is clear is that the bullets flew in all directions, from one side to the other. Within minutes, the square was nearly empty, leaving behind the dead, the wounded, and a city that would never quite see labor movements the same way again. But here's the part that makes this story linger just a little bit longer after the smoke even clears. The identity of the person who threw the bomb was never definitively proven. Despite intense investigations, arrests, and a trial that captured international attention, the actual bomber was never brought to justice. Instead, authorities focused on a group of anarchists and labor activists, arguing that their words and associations made them responsible for the violence, even if they had not physically thrown the bomb. Were they right, or were they wrong? 8 men were put on trial. The proceedings were controversial from the start. The jury selection process was deeply flawed. The atmosphere was charged with fear and anger. Evidence was stretched to fit a narrative of conspiracy. Some of the accused had not even been present when the bomb exploded, and yet all 8 were found guilty. 7 were sentenced to death. 1 received a lengthy prison term. Appeals were made. Protests erupted around the world, and still the sentences largely stood. One of the condemned men died before his execution, taking his own life in a dramatic and painful way inside his cell. The remaining 4 who faced execution did so with defiance. They spoke, they shouted, they became symbols in their final moments. Their deaths did not end the story. If anything, they ensured it would be remembered, at least for a time. The aftermath of Haymarket reshaped the labor movement in the United States. Fear spread quickly. Employers tightened their control. Unions distanced themselves from more radical elements. The push for the 8-hour workday did not disappear, but it faced significant setbacks because of this protest. At the time, the executed men became martyrs in the eyes of many, especially internationally. Their story traveled far beyond Chicago, influencing labor movements across the world. And perhaps the most enduring legacy is this. May 1st, the day that began with peaceful rallies for shorter working hours, became known internationally as a day to recognize workers and their struggles. What started as a demand for time became a symbol of sacrifice, conflict, and the long, complicated fight for rights that many people today take for granted. So when you look back at Haymarket, it is not just a story about a bomb or about a riot. It's a story about fear, about power, about the consequences of collective action. It is about how quickly a movement can be reshaped by a single violent moment, and how narratives can be built around events that are never fully understood by anyone then or now. And maybe the most unsettling part is this. The central act that defined the entire movement remains unsolved. The bomb that changed everything still has no confirmed hand behind it, leaving behind a question that history has never quite been able to answer. So here's my history question for you. Do you think the Haymarket affair changed history more because of what actually happened that night, or because of how people chose to interpret and react to it afterward? Remember, it stalled the 8-hour workday. It didn't push it as forward as they wanted it to. And of course, as always, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments, and subscribe to the podcast History Happens so you never miss an episode.